June 23, 1944, 2 hours and 45 minutes in the morning, in the basement of the War Office in Whitehall, London. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, 69 years old, stood alone before a huge map of Normandy, illuminated by a single desk lamp. His thick, nicotine-stained fingers repeatedly tracing the red line representing Operation Overlord as ash from his Cohiba cigar fell unnoticed onto top-secret documents spread across the oak table, scarred by decades of empire-shaping decisions. His back bowed by the weight of 5 years of relentless war, his face marked by deep wrinkles that had not existed in 1939, Churchill held in his left hand a 23-page report prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that estimated American casualties in the first wave of assault on the beaches of Normandy at between 8,000 and 15,000 men in the first 24 hours, with pessimistic projections reaching 25,000 if German resistance was stronger than expected. He had read that report 17 times in the last 3 weeks, memorizing every number, every statistic, every cold, calculated projection of how many young Americans, boys ages 18 to 25 who had left farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, offices in New York, would never see the sunset of June 6, 1944. Churchill deposited his cigar in the crystal ashtray that had belonged to his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, filled a glass with 3 fingers of Johnnie Walker Red Label, his favorite Scotch whiskey from his days in South Africa 45 years earlier, and allowed himself a rare moment of absolute vulnerability that none of his generals, no member of parliament, no aide would ever witness. Silent tears ran down his cheeks as he whispered to the map as if the soldiers drawn there could hear him. "Forgive me, boys. God forgive me for knowing what I'm asking you to do." But when he finished his whiskey 3 minutes later, he wiped his tears with a linen handkerchief embroidered with his initials, relit his cigar, and walked to the direct telephone line that connected him to General Dwight David Eisenhower at the supreme headquarters of the Allied forces, because Winston Churchill knew with absolute and terrible clarity that those thousands of American soldiers needed to die, not despite their sacrifice being immense, but precisely because it was immense, and that he would insist on that plan even though he knew the exact cost in lives. Young people, it was the only decision that could save not just Britain, not just Europe, but Western civilization itself from a darkness that had already consumed half the continent. 6 months earlier, in January 1944, in the conference rooms of the Berghof barracks in the Bavarian Alps, General Feldmarschall Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel, 52 years old, decorated veteran of the First World War and commander of the German forces charged with defending the French coast, studied with increasing satisfaction the intelligence reports arriving daily about Allied preparations for an invasion of continental Europe. Rommel, whose piercing blue eyes and square jaw had become a symbol of German military efficiency after his campaigns in North Africa, was not a man given to underestimating enemies. His respect for British and American forces was well known and sometimes criticized by more fanatical Nazi officers, but even he could not hide a smile as his chief of intelligence, 43-year-old Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, presented the latest analyses on Allied amphibious assault capabilities. "Herr Feldmarschall," von Mellenthin began, pointing to aerial reconnaissance photographs showing troop concentrations in southern England. "Our calculations indicate that any large-scale invasion attempt will result in catastrophic losses for the Americans and British. Our Atlantic Wall defenses now include 2,500 fortified bunkers, 500,000 anti-invasion beach obstacles, 6.5 million land and sea mines, and 58 divisions strategically positioned along 5,000 kilometers of coastline." Rommel agreed, circling the beaches of Normandy on the map with red pencil. "The Americans are brave soldiers, von Mellenthin, but courage does not hold MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute from reinforced concrete bunkers with walls 2 meters thick. They will need to cross a 1/4 of a mile of open beach under direct fire from artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifles. And our simulations indicate that the first wave of assault will suffer casualties of 60 to 70% before reaching the seawall." He paused, lighting a No. 5 Eckstein cigarette, a brand he preferred since his time in Africa, and continued in a voice that mixed military respect with strategic confidence. General Eisenhower is a competent commander. He knows that. The British certainly know this. They learned it at Dieppe in 1942, when they lost 3,600 men in 9 hours trying to take a single port city. So, von Mellenthin, I ask you, what rational Allied commander, knowing these probabilities, would order a frontal invasion that would result in American and British losses that could easily amount to 30,000 to 50,000 men in the first 48 hours? Von Mellenthin, who had studied military history at the University of Berlin for 6 years before joining the Wehrmacht, responded with the confidence of one who had meticulously analyzed every scenario. No rational commander would do that, Herr Feldmarschall. That's why we remain confident that when the invasion comes, and it will come, it will be against the Pas-de-Calais, where the distance is shorter, just 33 kilometers from the English Channel versus 150 kilometers to Normandy, and where they can establish a beachhead with half the casualties. Rommel nodded, but a shadow of concern crossed his face for an instant. What if, he said slowly, the British are desperate enough to accept these losses? What if Churchill, who sent his own youth to slaughter at Gallipoli in the last war, is willing to sacrifice American soldiers in the same way? Von Mellenthin laughed, not cruelly, but with the assurance of one who believed he understood completely human and political nature. Herr Feldmarschall, with all due respect, Americans are not Germans. They do not have our Prussian discipline, our willingness to make absolute sacrifice. They are Democrats. They respond to public opinion, to pressure from families at home. If they lose 15 to 20,000 men in a single day, more Americans killed in 24 hours than in any battle in their entire history, the American population will demand the head of whoever gave the order. Churchill may be an old lion, but even old lions don't bite when they know their teeth are going to break. They bluff, they growl, but in the end they retreat. Normandy is a bluff. Pas-de-Calais is where they will come, because that is where they can come with acceptable losses. Rommel wanted to believe, but 52 years of life, including 4 years fighting British in the desert, had taught him never to completely underestimate the British capacity for suicidal stubbornness when its back was against the wall. 3,200 miles west in Washington, D.C., on January 28, 1944, General George Catlett Marshall, Jr., 63 years old, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, sat before President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Oval Office of the White House with a weight on his chest that had nothing to do with his heart problems diagnosed the year before. Marshall, whose impeccable military bearing and stern professorial face masked a profound capacity for human empathy, held a brown leather folder that contained updated casualty projections for Operation Overlord, prepared by the Pentagon's War Planning Division. Roosevelt, then 62 years old and visibly weakened by the polio that had confined him to a wheelchair for 23 years, lit a Camel cigarette from his signature ivory holder and said in that voice that had soothed a nation through the Depression and 3 years of war, "General Marshall Winston called yesterday. 3 times. He's having ulterior motives about Overlord. It says the numbers don't lie, that we're asking young Americans to walk through a slaughterhouse." Marshall took a deep breath, opened the folder, and forced himself to look again at the statistics he had memorized. Low estimate of 8,200 American deaths in the first 24 hours. Middle estimate of 12,500. High estimate of 21,300, with additional injuries of between 25,000 and 40,000, depending on the effectiveness of German resistance and weather conditions. "Mr. President," Marshall began, his voice maintaining a military firmness even as he discussed what amounted to putting to death a number of young Americans equivalent to the entire population of a small town. "Winston is correct about the numbers. Our latest analysis, based on intelligence reports on German defenses in Normandy, suggests that casualties in the first wave will be devastating. The 106th Division. The infantry landing on Omaha Beach will face what our analysts are calling a roughly 300-foot kill zone, where soldiers will be completely exposed to fire from at least 8 fortified bunkers, 12 machine gun nests, and 4 artillery batteries positioned on 50-foot-high cliffs, that offer the Germans a perfect firing angle. Roosevelt inhaled deeply on his cigarette, eyes fixed on a photograph of his 4 sons in military uniforms that he kept on his desk. Table. George, you're telling me we know these odds. We know we're going to send thousands of our boys to almost certain death, and yet Churchill wants us to continue. Marshall nodded slowly, and I agree with him, although it pains me to say so. Roosevelt stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. Explain to me then, General, how on earth do we justify this to the families of 8,000 to 20,000 American soldiers? How do I look at the mother of some 19-year-old kid from Nebraska and tell her that her son needed to die on a French beach? Marshall closed the folder, placed his hands on it as if he were swearing an oath on the Bible, and said the words he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. Mr. President, with all due respect, we do not need to justify this to 8,000 families. We need to justify to 80 million Americans why we didn't do everything necessary to win this war. Normandy is not a choice between a good plan and a bad plan. It's a choice between a terribly costly plan and complete defeat. He opened the folder again, pulling out a second set of documents. These are alternative projections, Mr. President. If we don't invade France in 1944, if we wait for more favorable conditions, for weaker German defenses, the Soviets will be in Berlin alone in 1945. Stalin will control not only Eastern Europe, but possibly France, Holland, Belgium, all of continental Europe. And sir, our most conservative estimates suggest that war prolonged for another 18 to 24 months will result in total American casualties, not in one day, but cumulatively, of 150,000 to 250,000 men, plus European civilians who will continue to die under Nazi occupation at the rate of approximately 15,000 per day, including Jews, gypsies, and political dissidents being systematically exterminated in what our intelligence agents call death camps, where Germans are murdering prisoners on an industrial scale. Roosevelt remained silent for 2 full minutes, long enough for Marshall to think that perhaps he had said too much, pushed too hard, crossed some invisible line between military advice and political pressure. At the same moment, crossing the Atlantic again, Churchill was meeting at number 10 Downing Street with his innermost circle of military advisors, including General Alan Francis Brooke, 60 years old, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Admiral Andrew Brown Cunningham, 61 years old, First Sea Lord, 2 men who had served with Churchill through all the darkest years of the war and who knew every one of his virtues and failings with brutal clarity. Brooke, a wiry Scotsman with a distinctive mustache and a temper that Churchill often described as appropriately explosive for a man who bears the name of a gun, laid his own reports of estimated casualties on the mahogany table with force calculated to attract attention. Prime Minister, Brooke said in the Glasgow accent that 40 years in London had failed to eliminate. We need to speak clearly about what we are asking of Americans. We have already lost an empire defending these islands. Dieppe cost us 3,600 men in 9 hours, mostly Canadians, and all we gained was confirmation that direct amphibious assaults against fortified positions are close to suicide. Now we're asking the Americans to do just that, but on a scale 50 times larger. Cunningham, a naval veteran whose graying beard and faded blue eyes had witnessed everything from Jutland in 1916 to the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940, added, "Winston, you know the numbers better than any of us. Prime Minister, these are not paper numbers. They're boys. American boys of 18, 19, 20 who are going to die because we insist that Normandy is the only way." Churchill, who had remained uncharacteristically silent during these objections, rose slowly from his chair, walked to the window overlooking Downing Street where London was darkened under the protection of a mandatory blackout. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 5 years of leading a nation through hell. "Alan, Andrew, do you believe I don't know this? Do you believe I don't see your faces every night when I close my eyes? Young Americans I have never met, who I will never meet, whose names I will never know, but whose deaths I will order with my signature on operation documents." He turned to face them, and both veteran generals, men who had seen combat in 2 world wars, were shocked to see tears in the Prime Minister's eyes. In 1915, when I was 40 years old and First Lord of the Admiralty, exactly the age that many of these American boys are now, if you think about it, I sent British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian troops to Gallipoli. 131,000 men died because I insisted on a plan that every general told me would be too costly. I carried these deaths for 29 years. Every one of them. Do you know how many times I considered suicide because of Gallipoli? Brooke started to speak, but Churchill raised his hand. Let me finish. Gallipoli taught me something terrible, something that no man should need to learn, but that every wartime leader eventually learns. Sometimes the right choice costs lives, sometimes many lives, and sometimes you have to make that choice knowing exactly how many lives it will cost. Not because you are a monster, but because you understand that not making that choice will cost even more lives. Gallipoli failed because I was right about the strategy, but wrong about the execution. Normandy is different. Normandy will work. But it will work because Americans will pay a terrible price that no army should ever have to pay. He returned to his chair, relit the cigar he had extinguished, and continued. The Germans expect us to be rational. They expect us to calculate casualties versus gains and retreat. Rommel is placing all his reserve divisions near Calais because he does not believe that any sane commander would send men to Normandy when he knows he will lose 15 to 20,000 in the first 24 hours. He is correct that no sane commander would do that. But Rommel does not understand that we are not sane anymore. We cannot give in to the luxury of sanity. Hitler stole our sanity in 1939 when he invaded Poland, stole it again in 1940 when he tried to bomb us into submission, stole it for good when he began systematically murdering the Jews of Europe in numbers that our minds cannot even fully comprehend. Controlling Europe for 2 more years, 5 more years, maybe forever, and that will mean millions of deaths, not thousands. It will mean the end of civilization as we know it. Cunningham, naval to the bone, a man who understood necessary sacrifice in ways few men did, asked the question that needed to be asked. What if you're wrong, Winston? What if we lose 20,000 men and the invasion fails anyway? Churchill looked directly at him and said in a voice that admitted no doubt, Then I will have sent 20,000 young Americans to their deaths for nothing, and history will judge me as the monster I always feared I was. But Andrew, if we don't try, if we let the fear of casualties dictate our strategy, then we have already lost. Because war is not won by generals who choose battles they know they can win without cost. War is won by men who choose battles they must win, regardless of the cost, and then find the courage to pay that cost. Meanwhile, at training camp at Fort Benning, Georgia, at that very moment in January of 1944, Private First Class James Robert McAllister, 19 of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was writing a letter to his mother, Martha McAllister, 53, who had been working double shifts at a weapons factory since her husband, Robert James McAllister, 48, had died of a heart attack 14 months earlier when he received word that her son was enlisting in the Army despite having an educational deferral that could have kept him out of the war for at least another 2 years. James, a thin young man with blonde hair and blue eyes that made people in Cedar Rapids say he was a young version of Gary Cooper, wrote in careful handwriting on cheap paper, Army. Dear Mom, I know you're worried, but I want you to know that I'm fine and that the training is making me stronger every day. Lieutenant Morrison said we're the best company he's ever trained in, and that when we go to Europe, we're going to teach the Germans a lesson they'll never forget. Mom, I know Dad didn't want me to enlist. I know he died worried about it, but you need to understand that some of us need to go because if we don't go, who will? Tommy Henderson across the street, I'm only 17. Billy Patterson, who worked with Dad at the store, has a wife and a newborn baby. I'm 19. I don't have a wife or kids, and I'm strong and healthy, so I'm just the kind of person who should be here. Son who loves you, James. What James didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that in 6 months minus 2 weeks, he would be in the first assault wave hitting Omaha Beach at 6:30 minutes on the morning of June 6, 1944. That he would have exactly 17 minutes to live after the ramp of his landing craft lowered, that a German MG-42 machine gun bullet fired from a fortified bunker 220 meters away would pierce his chest straight through, right lung and heart at exactly 6 hours and 47 minutes, and that he would die thinking about his mother and the pear trees he would never plant. He also didn't know that Winston Churchill, a man he would never meet, who had probably never heard of him specifically, knew that James McAllister of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, would probably die, because Churchill had read the statistics that clearly said that out of every 100 men in the first wave of assault on Omaha Beach, 68 would not survive the first 2 hours, and that pursuing the plan knowing this was equivalent to signing a death sentence for thousands of James McAllisters spread across America. Back in London, 2 weeks later, on February 15, 1944, Churchill received a visit from General Dwight David Eisenhower, 53 years old, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, a man from Kansas with a famous smile that hid one of the most calculating military minds of his generation. Eisenhower arrived at the War Cabinet at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Churchill immediately noted that the American, usually relaxed even by military standards, was uncharacteristically tense. They exchanged formal greetings but dispensed with helpers, and when they were alone, Eisenhower wasted no time on preliminaries. "Mr. Prime Minister," he began, using a formal title rather than the casual Winston he normally employed. "I received this morning updated intelligence reports on German defenses at Omaha Beach. It's not good news." He placed aerial reconnaissance photographs on the table. "Rommel has added 8 new fortified bunkers in the last 6 weeks alone, doubled the number of anti-tank obstacles in the tidal zone, positioned 152nd Static Infantry Division directly behind Omaha. These are veteran troops from the Eastern Front, not conscripts. My amphibious assault experts are telling me that their original casualty projections were too optimistic. Now they're talking about potential casualties of 70 to 80% in the first wave." Churchill lit his cigar slowly, giving himself time to process information and formulate a response. "General Eisenhower, are you telling me that your original estimates of 8 to 15,000 American casualties in the first 24 hours might actually be 15 to 25,000? Eisenhower nodded, face grim. "Yes, sir. And frankly, Mr. Prime Minister, I need to say this directly. You are asking me to send young American soldiers, many of whom have never seen combat, against the most heavily entrenched defenses the world has ever seen, knowing that there is a better than 50-50 statistical chance that they will die within the first few minutes of landing. This is not military strategy. This is..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "This is dangerously close to intentional massacre." Churchill put down his cigar, stood, and for the second time in 2 weeks, veteran military men saw the British Prime Minister allow emotion to break through his famous composure. "Ike," he said, using his nickname for the first time in the conversation. "You think I don't know that? You think I've slept a single full night since they started those planning overlord? Let me tell you something I've never told anyone outside of Clementine." He filled 2 glasses with whiskey, handed one to Eisenhower. "In 1915, I was in command of the Admiralty when we sent troops to Gallipoli. I knew the casualties would be high, not as high as they ended up being, but I knew it would be costly. I sent these men anyway because I genuinely believed it was the right strategy. Gallipoli failed. 131,000 men died. My career was destroyed for a decade. But Ike, here's what I learned from Gallipoli that's relevant now. I was right about the strategy. Failure was not conceptual. It was inadequate execution, insufficient planning, poor command in the field. The idea of outflanking the Western Front through the Dardanelles was brilliant. We just didn't have the resources, time, or leadership to execute it properly. Normandy is different. Normandy has Eisenhower, not incompetent commanders we had at Gallipoli. Normandy takes 2 years of meticulous planning, not 2 weeks of hasty improvisation. Normandy has total air power, a dominant navy, and logistics we've gotten right this time." He drank his whiskey in one gulp. "But yes, you're absolutely right, it will be costly, terribly costly. And yes, I know that. And yes, I still insist that we need to do that." Eisenhower, not a man easily moved by rhetoric, even when it came from as masterful an orator as Churchill, remained skeptical. "Mr. Prime Minister, with all due respect, You will not have to look into the eyes of the American mothers whose children I sent to die. I will. So I need you to give me a reason better than trust me for why we should accept 20,000 American casualties in Normandy when we could potentially have 5,000 attacking Calais. Churchill walked over to the large map of Europe hanging on the wall, pointing to red lines representing Soviet forces in the east. Ike, where will Stalin be in December 1945 if we don't open a second front in France in 1944? Eisenhower studied the map. Best estimate? Warsaw has already fallen to the Soviets. They will be in Berlin, probably in Vienna, possibly in Prague and Budapest. Churchill nodded. And what kind of Europe will we have when the war is over? A Europe where Stalin controls everything from Berlin to the east, where he installs communist governments in every country he liberates, where half the continent is behind an iron curtain that may take decades, generations, to lift? Ike, we're not just fighting to defeat Hitler. We are fighting to ensure that when we defeat Hitler, the Europe that emerges will be a free, democratic, Western Europe, not Stalin-dominated Europe. And the only way to guarantee that is for us to be in France and Germany before the Soviets are. He returned to his chair. Now, let me ask you a difficult question, General. If instead of losing 20,000 men in one day in Normandy, we lose 50,000 men over 2 extra years of war because we didn't open a second front, because we let Stalin do all the heavy lifting, because we allowed Hitler to entrench himself deeper in France, what is the superior moral choice? 20,000 quick deaths that shorten war and save millions of civilians, or 50,000 slow deaths that prolong war and condemn Central and Eastern Europe to decades under communist totalitarianism? Eisenhower remained silent for a long time, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hands, staring into the amber liquid as if he could find answers there. Finally, he said, "Mr. Prime Minister, you are asking me to choose between 2 horrors and call one of them moral." Churchill agreed sadly. "Yes, Ike, that is exactly what I am asking, because that's what wartime leadership is. Don't choose between good and bad. Don't choose between right and wrong. To choose between terrible and catastrophic and then find the courage to live with your choice." Eisenhower finished his whiskey, placed his glass on the table, and stood. "Then God help us all, Mr. Prime Minister, because we're going to need it." Churchill also stood up, held out his hand. "He will, Ike, but first he expects us to do our part, no matter how painful." They shook hands, 2 men carrying the weight of decisions that would affect millions of lives, both knowing that history would judge them not for the lives they saved, but for the lives they cost. 3 months later, in May 1944, on the south coast of England, James McAllister of Cedar Rapids was finally finding out where his unit was going and what they would be asked to do. The information came during the company's final briefing, 3 days before the scheduled departure for the invasion. Captain R. Ichard Thomas Morrison, 28, of Boston, Massachusetts, graduate of West Point, class of 1939, a man whose usually cheerful expression had been replaced by something much darker in recent weeks, stood before 180 soldiers of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, the Blue and Gray Division, so called because it recruited from northern and southern states, and said words that would make each of them men rethink all their life choices that led them to that moment. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, voice forcibly steady, "the time has come to tell you exactly what we will face. In approximately 72 hours, this company will land in the first assault wave on a sector of beach on the coast of Normandy, France, codenamed Omaha Beach. I will not lie to you because you deserve the truth. Omaha is considered the most heavily defended beach on the French coast. German defenses include approximately 12 reinforced concrete fortified bunkers, 35 nests machine gun fire, 4 batteries of artillery positioned on cliffs as high as 45 meters, and extensive obstacle fields including steel hedgehogs, Belgian tetrahedrons, and Rommel stakes, thousands of them, designed specifically to destroy landing craft and impede tanks. He paused, and James could see the captain was struggling to maintain his composure. "Gentlemen, when your landing craft ramp lowers, you will be approximately 300 meters from the relative safety of the seawall. You will have to cross those 300 meters under direct fire from multiple machine guns and artillery. Statistically, and I apologize for having to say this so bluntly, approximately 2/3 of you will not reach the seawall. The room erupted in murmurs. Morrison raised his hand. I know this is terrible to hear. Can you believe I want to be here saying this? But here's what else you need to know. These statistics, these probabilities, they are not written in stone. They are based on average soldiers facing average defenses. You are not average soldiers. I trained you for 8 months. I know every one of you. I know that Johnson, he pointed to Private First Class Michael Johnson, 20 years old from Atlanta, can assemble and disassemble an M rifle. Garand in complete darkness in 23 seconds. I know that Rodriguez, Private First Class Carlos Rodriguez, 21 from El Paso, can read terrain better than any navigation instructor I've ever met. I know that McAllister, James felt everyone's eyes turn to him, can shoot a moving target at 200 yards while running, which I couldn't do when I graduated from West Point. Morrison stepped down from his small makeshift stage, walked between the rows of soldiers. So here's what we're going to do. We're going ashore. Some of us are going to get hit. Some of us are going to die before we get to the beach. This is reality, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But those who make it to the beach, those who make it through that death zone, you will be the most determined, best trained, toughest sons of bitches the German army has ever faced. And when we get to the top of those cliffs, and we will, we're going to make Germans pay for every inch of that beach. We'll make them rue the day they thought they could stop us. He returned to the front of the room. Last thing, I know many of you are wondering why Omaha, why not choose the less defended beach? The answer is because Omaha is where we need to be to make every invasion successful. If we fail at Omaha, the whole operation could fall apart. So yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's dangerous. But it's absolutely necessary. And generals who planned this, General Eisenhower, General Bradley, even Winston Churchill, they know what they're asking of you. They know the cost. And they're asking it anyway because there is no alternative that won't cost more lives in the long run. After the briefing, James found himself alone near the tents, looking at the English Channel unseen in the darkness. And for the first time since enlisting, he allowed himself to feel real fear. Not abstract fear of combat, but concrete, statistical fear that there was a 2 in 3 chance that he would be dead in approximately 75 hours. He thought of his mother, of the pear trees, of the life in Cedar Rapids that suddenly seemed infinitely precious precisely because he was about to risk it in ways he hadn't truly understood until that moment. Simultaneously, in Berlin, Rommel was having his own disturbing revelation. After months of insisting that an invasion would come to Pas de Calais, new intelligence was suggesting heavy concentration of ships allies in Portsmouth and Southampton, ports that would have made perfect sense for an attack on Calais but could also serve as bases for an assault on Normandy. In a meeting on May 28, 1944, with his general staff, Rommel for the first time expressed public doubts about previous assessments. "Gentlemen," he said, studying maps spread across the conference table, "I must consider the possibility that we have underestimated Allied resolve. We have received reports from captured prisoners, downed pilots, intelligence agents, that suggest that the Americans and British are preparing their troops specifically for high casualties. This is not the behavior of an army planning to attack Calais where casualties would be minimal. This is the behavior of an army preparing for something much more costly." Von Mellenthin, who had spent 6 months ridiculing the idea of an assault on Normandy, now seemed less confident. "Herr Feldmarschall, are you suggesting that Churchill might be willing to accept 20,000, perhaps 30,000 casualties to establish a beachhead in Normandy? That would be military madness." Rommel looked at him with an expression that mixed grudging respect and genuine concern. "Von Mellenthin, remember that we are talking about Winston Churchill, a man who sent his own youth to Gallipoli and who emerged from that catastrophe not broken but hardened. British people have an expression, in for a penny, in for a pound. Once they commit to something, they follow through, costs be damned. And Americans," he paused, thinking of reports on American industrial production that arrived daily and that continued to defy belief. "Americans have the resources to absorb losses that would cripple us. They can lose 20,000 men in one day and replace them in 2 weeks. We can't. He circled Normandy on the map. I've been thinking about this a lot. If I were Churchill or Eisenhower, if I had total air supremacy, a dominant navy, and industry that can produce ships faster than we can sink them, and if I were desperate to open a second front before Stalin takes over all of Europe, where would I strike? Von Mellenthin responded automatically. Calais, of course. Shortest distance, most obvious gateway to Germany. Rommel shook his head slowly. No. I would attack where the enemy doesn't expect it precisely because it is too costly. I would attack Normandy because you, my own staff, spent 6 months convincing me that no one would be crazy enough to attack there. And if you are convinced of that, then German commanders up and down the coast are convinced of that. Which means that Normandy may be less defended than it should be, because everyone assumes the attack will come elsewhere. He looked around the room. I want additional divisions moved to Normandy immediately. I want more beach obstacles, more mines, more bunkers, and most importantly, I want them to stop thinking like rational military men and start thinking like desperate men willing to pay any price. But it was too late. Germany's military bureaucratic machine moved slowly. Rigid hierarchy meant that Rommel's orders had to be approved by multiple levels of command, and resources were limited after 4 years of war on multiple fronts. Furthermore, Hitler personally still believed that Calais was a prime target, and refused to redeploy reserve divisions that he deliberately kept out of Rommel's reach. When June 6th arrived, defenses at Omaha Beach were formidable, but not insurmountable, fortified but not impenetrable, just as Churchill had bet they would be. At 5:50 on the morning of June 6, 1944, James McAllister was in the Higgins landing craft, rocking violently in the cold gray waves of the English Channel, surrounded by 35 other soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, all drenched by the saltwater spray that lashed constantly over the sides of the boat, many vomiting from seasickness or sheer fear, and no one speaking because there was nothing to say that wasn't too obvious, ridiculous, or terrifying to verbalize. James could hear distant explosions as Allied warships hammered German defenses, could see artillery flashes illuminating gray fog, and could feel boats speeding toward the beach that he couldn't see yet, but knew was there, waiting, armed with machine guns and mortars and artillery, all aimed exactly where his boat was headed. At his right side, Private First Class Robert David Wilson, 19, from Portland, Oregon, gripped his rifle so tight his knuckles were white, eyes fixed on nothing, lips moving in silent prayer. On his left side, Corporal Timothy James O'Brien, 20 years old, of Chicago, Illinois, he was vomiting for the 4th time, even though there was nothing left in his stomach to expel. At the front of the boat, Lieutenant James Morrison, Captain Morrison's younger brother, 23-year-old recent West Point graduate, checked his watch obsessively, each glance showing that they were 5 seconds closer to the moment the ramp would lower and they would have to exit into what briefings had called the active kill zone. At 6 hours and 29 minutes and 40 seconds, the boat hit a sandbar approximately 320 meters from the beach, and James saw Lieutenant Morrison shout something that he couldn't hear over the noise of engines and explosions, but which he knew meant that the ramp was about to lower. At exactly 6 o'clock and 30 minutes, the ramp fell with a metallic crash. Seawater invaded the boat, and the first line of soldiers began to advance into water that was chest deep. James was in the 3rd row, so he had approximately 3 seconds to process what he saw. Soldiers in front of him entering the water, silhouettes of cliffs through the fog, flashes of machine gun fire, and then Wilson at his side literally exploded as a 20-millimeter machine gun bullet hit him in the chest, covering James with warm blood and bits of tissue and flesh that his brain refused to identify as parts of a human being who had been alive 3 seconds before. James fell off the ramp into freezing water that stole his breath, submerged completely for 2 seconds that felt like eternity, emerged spitting out salt water and Wilson's blood, and began moving toward the beach because his brain went into automatic mode when faced with absolute terror, following training when conscious thought became impossible. All around him, men were dying with a speed and variety that turned the beach into a literal industrial slaughterhouse. Soldiers being cut in half by machine gun fire, exploding when they stepped on mines, drowning as injuries caused them to fall and heavy equipment pulled them under, screaming for doctors who couldn't reach them because doctors were also being hit. Dying in silence or dying screaming, but always dying with a frequency that made 60 to 80% casualty statistics seem not like estimates, but self-fulfilling prophecies. James does not consciously remember crossing the beach because severe trauma memory does not work linearly, but physical evidence would later reconstruct that he covered 292 meters in approximately 14 minutes, an extraordinarily long time that meant he was moving, falling, dragging, rolling, pausing behind obstacles, always moving forward but slowly because fast forward meant instant death and slow forward meant marginal possibility of survival. At 6 hours and 43 minutes, he reached a partial depression in the sand approximately 200 feet before the seawall, threw himself into it, and for the first time since leaving the boat, allowed himself to stop long enough to assess the situation. He was alive, which in itself was a statistical miracle. He was injured but not seriously. A bullet had gone through his left thigh but had missed his femoral artery by inches, and he still had his rifle and ammunition, which meant he was still a functional soldier rather than a casualty. He looked back and saw the beach strewn with bodies, some motionless, some still moving weakly, gray waves already beginning to drag some back out to sea, and he counted approximately 15 soldiers from his vessel of 36 still alive and mobile. Exactly the statistics Captain Morrison had predicted. 60% casualties in the first 15 minutes. At that moment, in Berlin, Rommel was receiving first confirmed reports of invasion, and his face as he read radio messages from field commanders revealed something von Mellenthin had never seen before. Rommel shaken to the core. "Normandy," Rommel said, voice empty of any satisfaction at having been partially right about the possibility. "Attacked Normandy. 5 beaches simultaneously. Omaha Beach reports defenses are holding. Enemy casualties are devastating. But Americans keep coming, despite losses." Von Mellenthin studied reports, making quick calculations. "Herr Feldmarschall, based on observed vessel numbers and reported casualties, Americans have already lost an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 men at Omaha alone, and they have not yet established a secure beachhead. This is exactly what we predicted. Attack is suicidal." But Rommel, looking at the large map showing all 5 invasion beaches and noting that despite fierce resistance, Allies were gaining ground in Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, even while Omaha remained contested, he understood something that von Mellenthin didn't understand. Numbers no longer mattered. "Von Mellenthin," Rommel said calmly, "they don't care about the numbers. Churchill knew it would cost 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 men, and he sent them anyway. And they're coming anyway, because," and here his voice carried reluctant but genuine respect, "because they decided that winning was worth any cost, and we never fully understood what kind of determination that represents." He threw reports on the table. "We will fight, of course. We will make every meter costly. But von Mellenthin, war is already lost. It was lost the moment Churchill signed the order sending men to Omaha knowing how many would die, because that kind of determination, willingness to pay absolutely any price for victory, that cannot be defeated by tactics or fortifications or technical superiority. It can only be matched by equivalent determination, and Germany no longer has that determination. We are fighting not to lose. They are fighting to win. And there is a fundamental difference between these two stances that decide wars." Returning to Omaha Beach, at 11:15 on the morning of June 6th, James McAllister had finally reached the top of the cliffs, part of a group of approximately 40 soldiers from various units who had come together organically after formal leadership disintegrated under casualties. Captain Morrison was dead, hit by mortar at 8:20. Lieutenant James Morrison was dead, killed by sniper fire at 9:40. Of Alpha Company's 180 men, 53 had reached the top of the cliffs, exactly the 70% casualty rate that statistics had predicted. But these 53, including James, were now battle-hardened fighting force in ways that no training could replicate, soldiers who had faced statistically probable death and survived, and who now fought not with idealism or abstract patriotism, but with visceral rage against an enemy who had killed 2/3 of their friends. When they first encountered the German bunker, there were no heroic speeches or complex tactical maneuvers. They simply threw grenades through the firing holes, waited for explosions, and then went in shooting at anything that moved. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the Omaha beachhead was finally secure, in the sense that the Allies controlled approximately 2 kilometers deep and 5 kilometers wide, enough space to begin unloading tanks, artillery, and reinforcements that would turn a tenuous invasion into a sustained offensive. Final cost of Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. Approximately 2,400 American soldiers killed, 1,800 wounded, total number of casualties close to Churchill's most optimistic projections, and significantly lower than pessimistic projections, but still large enough to represent the greatest loss of American life in a single day since the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War in 1862. James McAllister of Cedar Rapids was not among the dead, although his thigh wound meant he would be evacuated to a field hospital within 2 days and eventually sent back to England to recover. He would survive the war, return to Cedar Rapids in May 1945, and live to be 86, dying in 2011 surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. But he would never plant those pear trees with his mother, because Martha McAllister had suffered a fatal stroke in August 1944, when she received an erroneous telegram from the War Department that James had been killed in action, a telegram that was later corrected 3 days later. Too much for Martha, whose heart simply stopped when she read that her son was dead. James would spend the rest of his life knowing that statistically, he should have been the one to die on Omaha Beach, that Churchill and Eisenhower had sent him and thousands like him to die knowing the odds, and that his survival was just random luck in a system designed to accept his death as an acceptable cost of strategic victory. 6 weeks later, on July 20, 1944, Churchill was again in the War Cabinet, this time with final casualty reports from the entire Operation Overlord. Total numbers were simultaneously horrific and miraculously smaller than pessimistic projections. Approximately 10,000 Allied deaths on D-Day, including 2,500 Americans, with additional injuries bringing total casualties to approximately 10,400. Numbers were still devastating in human terms, 10,400 families who received a telegram but strategically, they represented success beyond the most optimistic hopes, because those casualties had bought beachhead that had now expanded to include virtually all of Normandy. Because Allies were bringing supplies across beaches at a rate that outstripped Germany's ability to reinforce defenses. And because, most importantly, Stalin now knew that the West was seriously committed to Hitler's defeat, which meant that Europe's post-war arrangement would be negotiated between 3 powers rather than simply dictated by Moscow. Churchill silently read numbers, closed his folder, and wrote in his personal diary an entry that would remain private until his death. Today I received confirmation that Overlord cost the lives of approximately 10,400 Allied soldiers, mostly American, all young, all with families who loved them, all with futures that will now never be. I wonder, as I have every day since we signed operation plans, whether I was right. I knew the cost would be high. I insisted on the plan even though I knew, and now the final numbers are in front of me. Of me, numbers that are faces and names and stories that I will never know but that ended because I insisted. I feel the weight of it in ways that words cannot adequately capture. But I also know this. Without Overlord, without those 10,400 deaths and approximately 37,000 additional injuries, war would have continued 2 more years. Hitler would have developed even more terrible weapons. Stalin would have controlled all of Europe, and millions of civilians, Jews, Poles, French, Dutch, Belgians, Russians, would have died while we waited for plan. Better than would ever come. So yes, it was right. Terribly, painfully, inexcusably right. And I will carry the faces of those soldiers I never knew for the rest of my life, not as a burden, but as a moral obligation to remember that decisions of leaders in wartime are bought with the blood of young men who trusted them. History will judge me, as it must, lost, and that if I had any other choice that would spare their lives without condemning millions of others, I would have made it. But there was none. And so I made the only decision I could, knowing the cost, and now I live with consequences. He never published that entry, never showed it to anyone except his wife Clementine, because Churchill understood that some burdens must be borne privately by leaders, not shared with the public who deserve to believe that their leaders do not make decisions that cost young lives lightly. 25 years later, in June 1969, James McAllister, then 44 years old, a high school history teacher in Cedar Rapids and father of 4 children, was watching television coverage of the 25th anniversary of D-Day when a reporter interviewed a British historian about overlord planning. A historian, a man named Dr. Martin Gilbert, who was writing Churchill's definitive biography, said something that made James pause and pay attention in a way he hadn't done to the news in years. One of the most extraordinary aspects of overlord, Gilbert was saying, is that Churchill knew from very early on that casualties would be devastating. Now declassified documents show that he had reports estimating between 10,000 and 25,000 Allied casualties on D-Day alone, and he insisted on proceeding anyway. Not despite these projections, but with full knowledge. Some historians have criticized this as unforgivable cynicism, the sacrifice of American lives for British political goals. But I think a fairer analysis is that Churchill faced an impossible choice between 2 horrors, and chose what he believed would result in fewer total deaths, even if he concentrated those deaths on a single catastrophic day, rather than spreading them out over years. James slowly turned off the television, walked to the garage where he kept a metal box containing his military decorations: Purple Heart for wounding in Omaha, Bronze Star for action under fire, several campaign medals, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to really think about June 6, 1944. He thought about Wilson exploding next to him, about Morrison dying calling for his mother, about O'Brien drowning in foot-deep water because his wound left him unconscious for 10 seconds, and that was enough for heavy equipment to drag him under. He thought about how Churchill had probably known the statistics that said 60 to 80% of them wouldn't survive the first hour. He thought about how he had hated Churchill for years for sending him and your friends to that beach. And then, for the first time, he thought about the alternative. If they hadn't invaded in June 1944, if they had waited, if Churchill had backed down from projected casualties, where would the world be now? Stalin controlling Western Europe? Did Hitler have more years to perfect V-2 rockets and perhaps even develop atomic bombs? The war dragging on until 1946 or 47, with hundreds of thousands of additional American casualties and millions of additional European civilians killed? James found no easy forgiveness for Churchill at that moment. Omaha's wounds, literal and psychological, were too deep for that. But he found something more complex. A reluctant understanding that leadership in war sometimes means making decisions that cost thousands of lives precisely to save millions, and that men like Churchill who make those decisions carry a moral burden that never ends, even when the decision was right. He put the medals back in the box, but before closing it, he took out the small photograph he kept there. His unit before embarking, 180 young men smiling for the camera, 2/3 of whom would die within 48 hours. He studied their faces, whispered their names, the ones he still remembered at least, and then said aloud to the empty garage, "Churchill knew. The bastard knew we were going to die, and he sent us anyway. And God help me, I think he was right." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was recognition that some decisions are impossible but still necessary, and that history is made not by leaders who choose easy options, but by those who choose terrible options when they are the only options available that offer a path to victory and the preservation of a civilization worth saving.